Welcome back to MythVision podcast. I am joined by two outstanding scholars today, Doctors Christy Cobb and Dr. Katherine A. Am I pronouncing that properly still?
You got it exactly right.
Yes. Awesome. Well, look, they are editors of a groundbreaking new volume, Ancient Slavery and its New Testament Context. The book is here, pinned in the chat. Get you a copy. It's only $8. Come on. Now's the time to jump on it. This book tackles a subject that many readers of the Bible are uncomfortable facing. Slavery is not only present in the New Testament world, it's everywhere. And we're going to cover this. From Paul's letters to the household codes, from the language of the Lord or Lord and slave to the very structure of early Christian communities, slavery shaped it all. Dr. Cobb and Dr. Shaner bring together a team of scholars who shine a light on the lived realities of enslaved people in the ancient Mediterranean, exploring how race, gender, and sexuality intersected with enslavement. They show how these realities are often hidden beneath the surface of biblical text and why it matters that we confront them today. This is not just about history, it's about ethics. The book challenges each of us to read the New Testament honestly, to see the enslaved who have been silenced, and to recognize how ancient systems of exploitation echo in our modern world. It's an honor to welcome Dr. Christy Cobb and Dr. Katherine A. Shaner to MythVision. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much. I hope the introduction was okay. I put a little work into that.
That was beautiful. I wish we'd hired you to write our abstracts.
Thank you so much. Hey, I appreciate the compliments. And the audience, be sure to check out the book again. We're going to dive into the contents with Q&A here in just a second, but I want to say this is their first time joining me here at MythVision, and it's an honor to have you both here. I love building my resume with brilliant minds, PhDs, experts, different angles, and your book is a must get, I must say. So when you're ready, if you have anything you want to say before we begin, I have questions, and we can just start diving into some of these things, tantalizing our viewers to get a copy of the book.
I feel ready. Do you?
Let's jump in. Let's do it.
Good.
All right. What is the meaning of the universe? No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. Your book confronts the tendency in scholarship and theology to ignore or whitewash slavery in the New Testament. What motivated you both to take on this project?
That is a great question, Derek, because it's such a heavy topic. And we're both scholars of these materials who have spent most of our careers thinking about slavery and researching and studying it. But this was like right during the pandemic. Christy was at a different institution here in North Carolina. I'm at Wake Forest University. She was at Wingate University. And we started talking over Zoom because we have a friend and mentor in common, Mary Foskett, here at Wake Forest. And we started talking to each other about, look, you teach this class, you must teach a class called Slavery in the New Testament. What do you use for the textbook? And I said, well, I'm looking for one. If you've got, I'd love your suggestion. She's like, well, I'm looking for one. I'd love your suggestion. And so part of what we started to do was to start to dream about what would our ideal textbook look like for both of our classrooms. Because I teach professional ministry students. I teach at the School of Divinity. So I teach master's level students and now doctor of ministry level students. And one of the things that I find, since we don't require a religion degree for folks to come, I find that when we get to some of the more dense scholarship, it's a little more difficult because they're just not in on the conversation in the same way that my fellow scholars are. And Christy was finding that she needed something that was accessible to 18-year-olds straight out of high school. And so we decided, we dreamed up our wish list of scholars of slavery, and we asked them if they would write 5,000 words on the thing they know best, and then let us edit it. And they did. They let us edit it. And they gave us really great stories and really great information. And we put the book together from there.
Did Jennifer Glancy join in that? I imagine she was part of this.
Nancy is the book that we both always use in our classes. Yeah. Right? Her Slavery in Early Christianity, get yourself the new version of it. It's amazing. It's incredible. She was too busy to write for us, as one can imagine, but she did graciously endorse the book, and you can see the endorsements on the cover. And we have both worked with her pretty closely through most of our career. She's been an amazing conversation partner for us.
Absolutely. Just to show everybody, here is this blurb here for people. There's some really good names, excellent scholarship. So if you'd like to add to that, Christy, anything you'd like to add to that question?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I think the teaching part was what got us started on the conversation. But Derek, your first question about sort of dismantling this idea that about slavery being in the Bible, being in the New Testament, that was also a really big reason. I think both of us, when we go to speak places and when we encounter just people who are interested in our work, will say, well, wait, but didn't early Christians, say no to slavery? We're like, no, they didn't, right? And so I think we both had addressed this a number of times, that we wanted something really accessible to say, okay, slavery is there, just as your introduction said, sort of all over the New Testament into early Christianity. It's everywhere.
I would almost want to phrase this opening before we dive in. Is it safe to say, in both of your opinions, that the Christianity would not be Christianity if slavery was not in the vein of the pulse of the theology at its roots? I mean, of course, history is history. I'm not like trying to play a hypothetical, like, can we go back and change everything? But like, it's almost what makes Christianity is theologically is built into the whole fabric of slavery, if I'm not mistaken.
It is. I mean, do you want to go ahead, Catherine?
Go ahead, Christy.
Okay, I was just going to say, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, the idea of even just the language of enslaved to God, God is our enslaver. That language is right there in the very sort of, it's the fabric of the basics of Christianity. But also, one of our authors, Ulrika Roth, has made an argument that Christianity wouldn't have spread without enslaved labor. That's an argument in a different article in a different book earlier, but I agree with her. I mean, I think we needed the enslaved labor of people spreading the message, Christianity delivering letters such as the ones Paul wrote, right? Transcribing letters and gospels, and then also just being present in early church communities. They were doing all sorts of labor that really, I think, helped Christianity spread. Catherine, you want to add to that?
No, yeah, you hit it right exactly on the head there, Christy, because I think our ideas of freedom are tied to slavery. I think our ideas of God's absolute power are tied to metaphors of slavery. I think our ideas of what service is are tied to slavery. And so, this is one of the reasons that I started even thinking about slavery as a major topic for my scholarly and my theological program as a pastor and as a scholar and a teacher, because until we reckon with how shot through our histories, our texts, our theologies are with images of slavery, I don't think we've done our due diligence in terms of understanding God as compassionate, God as just, God as one who repairs the world, right? And so for me, you are absolutely right, Derek. I don't think that Christianity looks the way that we understand it today without slavery. Wow. I think so. In some ways, what I guess we're calling for is a reformation of sorts, says the Lutheran among us.
Oh, you would, right?
I would.
My next question is, you stress that enslaved people are often hidden in biblical stories. How does centering their experiences change the way we read the New Testament?
Yes, I mean, I hidden is such an interesting phrase, because they're there all the time, right? But they've been hidden by scholars, commentators, the readers, right? I haven't noticed them, and that's for a number of reasons, such as translation, right? For many years, the language of slavery was translated differently. For instance, calling someone a servant is quite different than calling someone enslaved, right? So the language has hidden them, and then of course many commentators of the New Testament didn't pay attention to this kind of the dynamics of slavery in the New Testament in the first place. Katherine, you want to sort of add to how centering changes?
Right. And I think centering it not only shows us all those places that Christy is talking about where they come up through the language, but centering enslaved experience also shows us oftentimes the violence and the dehumanization that is part of that enslaved experience, and the ways, and it becomes such a stark sensibility when you start to see how ubiquitous slaves and slavery are in the New Testament. It changes our experience of it because it changes something in us. We see some of the violence that religious traditions can do, even religious traditions that claim loving kindness at their center.
I feel like I might as well get the huge chip off my shoulder, and like this is like the biggest, where this question goes, because there are many modern Christians who are much more on the fundamentalist spectrum of some sort, and they take the Bible as pure sacred. They have the inerrant infallible approach, and therefore these are sacred words. And I get it. I think there's a reason cognitively are forced. They're forced to do something with this. So there's an obvious fact, and you point the evidence out. It's there. It's in the fabric of everything we're having, in the language, the whole nine. So what they do is they defend it. They find a way. They're doing apologetics, but they find a way to say, well, slavery isn't what we think of. It's not that kind of slavery. It's the good kind of slavery. It's the good kind of being owned by another human being, or it's the good kind of being enslaved as an indentured servant. And there's always these explanations, and it's easier because I've had a lot of Old Testament academics. Joshua Bowen wrote a very dense book on slavery about the Old Testament, but the New Testament hasn't been tackled as much. And so can you address the moral dilemma we're facing here, and why we should not be defending such a thing, even coming from someone who's an expert in theology and teaches modern people in divinity and all that? Because someone watching this might go, Derek, that's just your ex-Christianity. You have just a tactic against Christianity, and you don't like it, so you're just trying to debunk it. And it's like, actually, I would much rather Christians find a way to see the nasty and then maybe find the good and do something with it. So whoever wants to start first, would you like to start, Katherine?
I can start for sure. Yeah, I mean, so we hear this all the time. Oh, it wasn't that kind of slavery. It wasn't chattel slavery. It wasn't as violent as it was in the antebellum South in the US. But Christian masters were way different than non-Christian masters. We hear all of this, and actually it's embedded in much of the scholarship, sort of the more public-facing scholarship on biblical studies, on New Testament studies. It's that idea is embedded throughout. When Paul calls himself a slave of Christ, for example, it's often translated as servant of Christ, but the word is doulos, is slave. And, it's often like, well, it wasn't that kind of slave. It was all the good things. It was all the obedience of slavery. It was all of the, ways that God owns him and he doesn't own himself. And I keep coming back to this idea that you have to know something about what it is to not own yourself in order to understand even that metaphor. And the fact that we know that something tells us that we are still dealing with slavery systems in our near past, because that's how most of us know about slavery systems, right? And so even if we, sometimes we get accused of anachronism, right? Well, you can't be anachronistic. Slavery then was different than it is today. And yes, it was. There were some major differences. But there's also a reason why when we start reading about slavery in the 18th and 19th century in the US, there's a reason why it resonates so deeply with when you start reading about slavery in the 1st and 2nd centuries. It's because Jefferson and Madison and all of those guys, they're reading the same texts. They're reading Cato, they're reading Varro, they're reading Aristotle, they're reading all of these guys, and they're constructing the American slave system on the Roman slave system. And here's the kicker. Jefferson says, those Romans were beasts. At least we as slave owners are much kinder to our slaves. Jefferson says this.
Wow.
Yeah. So, you start to get into these comparisons, and all of a sudden what you start to see is the only thing that really matters ultimately for me, let me just back up. For me, in terms of faith formation, the only thing that really matters is what our questions are about how we treat our neighbor today.
I love that.
And if our memory of how we're supposed to treat our neighbor is about slavery, well, then we need to start to have resources to think differently about how we treat our neighbor.
It's you have like a living progressive view about how do we negotiate with each epoch, each era, each generation, and that is very powerful. I really appreciate that. Yeah.
Well, to tell you the truth, I think it's the only reason we're still reading the Bible is because it's capable of that kind of conversation across all the eras and epochs. Now, there's all kinds of power involved in it. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But, sort of one of the things that I often talk about when folks ask me about inerrancy and infallibility is I say to them, I don't believe in those things. And it's not that I'm not Christian because I don't believe in those. It's that I have a different kind of authority that I understand in the biblical text that comes out of actually my Lutheran tradition, right? Yeah. And it is this, that the Bible is the surest place we can be in conversation with God. It's not the place that tells us what to do. It's not, it's not the Bible. Yes, that's the book for me. It's the place where we get to go and wrestle with God and wrestle with the stories of our ancestors and wrestle with the hiddenness of our ancestors in faith who were enslaved, right? And so in that wrestling, think about Jacob. He wrestled with God and was injured because of it. Think about Abraham. He bargained with God. Moses, he bargained with God. The people in the Old Testament who are friends of God are people who argued with God. So Why don't we get to argue with God? Why don't we New Testament people get to argue with Jesus?
I like it. Christy, would you like to add to that?
I think this is why I was like, Katherine can have this question. But I will say this is what made us I think a good pair for taking on this book, because Katherine has the sort of ministerial focus, and I'm a little bit more like, okay, if the Bible says this and I disagree, that's okay. It doesn't. It's but I get these questions a lot from people that I'm having to, especially when it comes to Jesus, right? That I often have to sort of to think about, to navigate, because it is difficult when you say this is your word of God. For many people, this is their spiritual book, and it has things like, Jesus sort of being okay with systems of slavery. Paul talking about enslaved persons and sending them back to their enslaver. And, so that's difficult for many people. And so I think it is, but I think it's so important. So I like the wrestling analogy too, Katherine.
I actually brought that up to my brother yesterday. Most of my family are believers. I think I'm more like you, Christy, where I personally am like, I don't need it, but I know that I live in a world where many people have it. And so it's like, okay, well, listen, who do you want in your world? People who are more like you, who find their own spirituality and engage with this material, this tradition in a certain way, or do we want to have fundamentalists running around? I'd prefer the former, not the latter, in terms of the shaping of the world I can live in. We shouldn't be stuck in, well, I say Martin Luther said this, and I agree with Martin Luther. He's our father in the tradition. I hope we're wrestling with that guy. You know what I mean? So, so you brought up language, and very powerful. One of your chapters explores the language of enslavement enslavement in the New Testament. Why does it matter whether translators use slave or enslaved person? And what's at stake in those choices?
So first of all, I mean, we did sort of, as we decide to write the book, our authors use a variety of different ways to do this, because there's not really consensus yet in scholarship on slave versus enslaved, right? But the one chapter that sort of is at the beginning of the book to talk about this leans into the language of agency. So it's this idea that when you are using the word slave, which is a word that ancient persons would have used, it also meant object. It meant, a basically body, right? Soma was another word that they would often use for an enslaved person. And so it wasn't a word that sort of allowed for the humanity of those people who had been enslaved. So when talking about slave versus enslaved, the enslaved person sort of centers the humanity of that person, right, as a human, and it also sort of points a finger at the agency of the enslaver, right? Like instead of saying master or right, it's saying, okay, this person is enslaving this person, right? And so it highlights the agency from sort of both sides. Like someone is choosing to be an enslaver and someone is not choosing to be enslaved, but they are still human and we view them as fully human, right? And so, and much of this decision in language is coming from scholars who do work on transatlantic slavery. So there's this website that's out there, and it says it's called something like Teaching or Speaking About Slavery. This Might Help is the resource. And there's a list of things, and it says use enslaved, lean into the agency, recognize that persons who are enslaved are fully human, right? Even if they weren't given the legal, the same legal permissions as others who were free, right? Yeah.
Wow. Katherine, would you like to add something to that?
Well, I think there's a kind of voyeurism that our language creates, right? And so part of what we're trying to do is shift the rhetoric, shift the rhetorical perspective. Because a lot of times when we talk about slavery, we want to talk about the violence of it. We want to talk about the exploitation of it. We want to talk about the objectification that's part of it. But to remind ourselves over and over and over that violence, that exploitation, that objectification involves human beings, and not just human beings with bodies, but human beings with souls, as Revelation reminds us, human beings who have families, who have language, who learn things, who, like just like us, people, they're just like us, right? I mean, right. So, and I think part of what happens when we adopt master-slave language is that we're adopting the language of the enslaver. We're adopting the language of the one who owns slaves, because it's a good thing to be a master. It's not a good thing to be a slave, right? And so what we're doing is trying to flip the rhetoric to remind us that there's people on both sides and there's action on both sides. And it's the action of slavery that is problematic, as well as the forgetting, the convenient forgetting of the humanity of enslaved people.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Paul's use of the word Kyrios, Lord, Master, has echoes of enslaver. How should modern readers reckon with that linguistic overlap?
I think people should be, when they see the word Lord, thinking of an enslaver, right? In antiquity, they would have been, right? That was that was the way that an enslaved person referred to their enslaver, male or female, right? Curious. And so when we've lost that a little bit in time because we now just always translate it as Lord, but in antiquity, it's certainly a part of the language of slavery. And so, yeah, I mean, I think when we read it, there should be some bells going off that we're thinking about how this was used in the language of slavery, systems of slavery.
If I may phrase it differently for you, Katherine, just so that everyone is following, because you're in a modern context trying to make people aware of this, but also they have a living faith that they're currently practicing. How do you negotiate with this? Because, you know, when we're reading it, you see the same problem me and Christy see here, and we're all singing Kumbaya. But how can we read the New Testament then if it's loaded with this kind of language? How do we get around that in your view, or what do you personally choose to do on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think this question is especially hard because the term gets used for Jesus, Lord Jesus Christ. I mean, how many times has that phrase rolled off my tongue, right, when I'm leading worship or whatever it is? You know, I think two things. What Christy said is actually part of my own spiritual discipline, honestly, is to remind myself that term isn't innocent. It's not innocent, and yet, a lot of times we don't have another term, or it's our heart language still, right? And so part of it is that I feel the very tension of it. And for me, that tension, right? That tension of this thing that I love, this spiritual world that I want to be a part of, this praise and worship around the throne, you know, like it's all hopelessly imperialistic. And yet there's a feeling there that I can't invoke any other way. And so I have to be clear with myself that the tension for now is okay until I find the place where that tension leads me. Because I think actually the tension is what's going to lead us to the solution.
Gotcha. Kind of like rabbis who saw, I mean, there were many rabbis who wrote about some pretty horrific stuff in the Old Testament. And they called it out. They weren't fans of it, but they still continued their tradition. And so you have your tradition. I just wondered, how do you and your students engage this? Are you doing like a rabbi would? Are you saying this isn't good? And
yeah,
I don't know. It's a tough
one. No,
I
point it out to them. Like not my favorite, but you know, like one of the hardest things that I point out to them is Luke 17. Where Jesus is talking to his disciples, and they've just come in from the field, and Jesus says to the disciples, okay, who among you would tell your slave to go sit down while you made dinner? No, the slave goes and makes dinner while you sit down and, you know, and make yourself comfortable, et cetera, et cetera. And then what Jesus says to the disciples is, go and do likewise. You should say at the end of the day, I don't need thanks. I am a worthless slave, right? It's just like, it's heartbreaking to hear this out of Jesus's mouth. And of course, I can do the, you know, biblical scholar redaction criticism stuff and say, well, this is really Luke making up what Jesus is saying because Luke's trying to show that Jesus is the better emperor. And, you know, but at the end of the day, I still have to wrestle with the fact that Jesus told me I'm a slave. And I don't like it. And I argue with Jesus about it all the time.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're arguing with him. I mean, that
somebody's got to, right?
Someone's got to.
But you're right about the rabbinic tradition. I mean, I think that's part of what we need to recover too, is some of that rabbinic tradition of argument.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. What should people know about the realities of Roman slavery, the violence, commodification, and dehumanization that shaped the world of Jesus and Paul?
I think the first thing to know is that these are people who came from other people. Right. I mean, so Orlando Patterson in the 1980s does this landmark study in sociology on what a slave society is. And he gives us this definition where he says enslaved people are natally alienated. That is, they're ripped from their families of origin. He says enslaved people are permanently dishonored, which is to say that enslaved people are are folks who never have a very high, they are always looked at with suspicion, and they've got a little stain on them or a big stain on them within their society, and that they are socially dead. That is to say, they are not able to create permanent social relationships in the way that free people are. That is, you can be ripped from your partner, right? Let's say, you have a partner and you have children together and one of you gets sold off. That would happen in the Roman Empire frequently. So the Roman Empire, and Patterson uses this definition and turns it on, he develops it out of Greek and Roman societies and then says like, hey, there's all these other societies that operate with slavery in the same way. Now you notice race wasn't part of that. So in the ancient world, race is a factor. Race and ethnicity is a factor in terms of enslavement. We hear all this discourse about, the Germanic slaves are really great oxen, basically, right? They're really strong and they're really brutes, but they have no reason and rationality whatsoever. Greek slaves, on the other hand, have this great philosophical tradition and they have beautiful handwriting, and you want yourself a Greek slave if you're going to have somebody who's going to write things for you. Like Jewish slaves are from the backwaters, so you're going to have to civilize them a little bit, right? There's all these sort of like ethnic stereotypes that the Romans perpetuate about enslaved people in antiquity, but it's not the black-white skin difference that we see in American slavery.
I'll add some. Yeah,
Christy's got some other things to say too.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, you did a great job, Katherine. I think I'll add that also. Enslaved persons were a part of the family dynamics in the household. So in the Roman world, enslaved women were often midwives, were wet nurses, did childcare. They were basically doing all of the sort of domestic tasks and many other tasks that allowed the enslavers to then go out into the world to be free. Right. And so enslaved persons were a part of all of this, this sort of daily, everything really that a daily person might do in the Roman world. And then I'll add something also about socioeconomic things in the Roman world. It seems like many people, even if they weren't very wealthy, could afford to purchase a slave. Right. Sort of even a mid-lower income family, let's say, might be able to afford one, right? So we should not imagine that it's only the really elite and the wealthy in the Roman world that were able to use the enslaved labor. It was, a lot of different people. There were more in the cities than were in rural areas, but there were also enslaved persons in rural areas helping with agriculture. And again, this sort of domestic life. So it really sort of permeated every aspect of life in the Roman world.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Again, get the book, because the book brings in material culture, inscriptions, mosaics, artifacts. Could you share an example where archaeology sheds light on the everyday lives of the enslaved in the first century Mediterranean world, please?
Oh, there's so many examples. Christy, should we do Acti first?
Yes, you do that. Yeah.
Okay. So Javal Coleman shares this inscription. It's a gravestone, and it's a gravestone of a young girl named Julia Procula, who has died. And when you see the dedication on the gravestone, it speaks that her father, Ephesians, has. Wait, am I getting that right? Stand by.
No worries. Is this is the one in your book, right?
This is the one in the book. Yeah.
Junia Procula. I have, if you want, I could just show the image briefly if you're comfortable with me doing that. I do. I have it right here just to show the stone.
Yeah. Okay. So Ephesians, Marcus Junius Ephesians, is Junia Procula's father. And you notice on the front side, so we're looking at the back side of the inscription right now. On the front side, there is a picture, and I don't think it's in the book, but there's a picture of a little girl, and underneath it, it says, this is dedicated in loving memory of Junia Procula by Marcus Junius Ephrosinus, and then there's an erasure. Right? Like someone's gone and chiseled the next name out of the stone, and then, may her memory be a blessing, or, whatever the Roman send-off is for her. Well, then when you go around to the backside of this monument, what you see is another set of writings. And these writings are written in Ephrosinus's name. And Ephrosinus it's a curse inscription. He's saying, oh my gosh, the gods need to curse Acti, who was my freed person, who was also my wife, right? So she was freed in order to marry Ephrosinus, we think. Catherine Hugh Miller's done this work. She's freed in order to marry Ephrosinus, but she's still his freed person. And she drugs him. She poisons him in his bed, and she absconds with several other enslaved people, as well as several children, this inscription tells us. And so we think that erased name on the front is actually Acti, and that Junia Procula's mother was Acti, and that Acti, as a former enslaved person, was removing herself from the exploitation of this situation, and maybe even taking her own children, maybe even her own children with Ephrosinus, with her into freedom. And he basically says, the curse is basically like, may they never have a moment's peace in the rest of their lives, or something like that. But Acti is this woman who we can see acting out of resistance to her enslaved state, and perhaps even on the for the purposes of bringing her children with her, right? For the sake of the future generations.
Wow,
it's incredible, and you don't hear these stories in New Testament worlds, right? You see them in the marks of slavery in the material world, and you also have to look for them in places where you wouldn't expect to see them when you're starting to look for material culture. So often we look for handcuffs and chains and slave collars, which there were. Like, they had these bronze collars that they'd put around enslaved people that say, my name is Felix and I ran away from so and so, make sure you take me back to him. Not a really great thing to have to wear around. But nonetheless, I would say in the 20th century, mid 20th century onward, most of the archaeological work that was brought to bear on enslaved people was things that showed their enslavement. Chains and shackles and containment devices, things like that. And once you start looking for some of the more subtle hints, like this inscription, you start to see that enslaved people are woven into every part of an ancient city when you look at its material culture, and it's just incredible.
Wow. Christy, anything you can add to that, or you can always defer to the next question. Just saying that if you don't. Yeah, please.
This is good. I'll add the work of Mira Green in our book, who basically looks at ancient kitchens and so as a piece of material culture, and she measured them. She sort of interacted with them as a scholar, but thinking about who would be utilizing this kitchen, and it is mostly enslaved persons. And so she sort of thought about the violence, or the sort of that will be done to a person's body who is using that kitchen daily. So the size, for example, she said they would have had to hunch over every day to be cooking. The heat elements that would have been so would have burned or scalded people, right? And so the material culture in just that aspect tells us more about enslaved experiences, right? Someone whose daily life would have been inside of the kitchen, and how they might have experienced that through her analyzing of material culture.
Oh my gosh. That sounds like a nightmare in a way, honestly.
Yeah, it does.
Oh my
I
goodness.
mean, bodies are marked by slavery. They just are. By the daily, day in and day out tasks of slavery, bodies become marked.
Yeah. Wow. In the book, you discuss Jews and slavery as well. How did Jewish practices and laws interact with the broader Roman system or Roman slave system? And the question kind of brings to mind a book I have back here somewhere, Cattell Berthelot's book, Jews and the Roman Rivals. She doesn't document this specific point, but it's all about documenting competition, the legal kind of Jews were inspired by pagan Rome before Christian Rome came on in competition with them. And so aspired to imitate and even reinterpret their laws in light of, the fact that Rome had a successful law system. So I guess really the question is just how did Jewish practices and laws interact with the broader Roman slave system?
Yeah, Catherine Hetzer is really the person who does that in our book. And I would commend to you any of her writing. She's got several books out on Jewish slavery in the Roman world. But, one of the things she does is exactly what you just mentioned, which is to say that Jews and Jewish folk had been living in Roman imperial worlds and in Greek Hellenistic worlds for a long time by the time Christians came about. Or by the time Christ followers who were Jews came about, who came, out of Jewish communities. I mean, like, how do we even talk about this in terms of language at some point? So Hetzer gives us a sense that Jewish folk were enslaving people under Roman laws, but that there were some debates about whether enslaved people who were brought into a family, whether they were Jewish or not. That was one of the debates that I think was happening, that Hetzer shows us through the rabbinic world. There's this question of, can you circumcise your slaves? And if you do, does that make them Jewish or does that just make them your slaves? Right? I mean, this is one of the questions that I've been investigating a little bit more lately. There are questions about how enslaved people interact with Jewish practices in the house, right? Are they expected to keep kosher? These kinds of things. And there's a lot that we don't actually know, in part because most of the Jewish folks that we know of from the Roman imperial world, right, from Asia Minor and Greece and those kinds of places, they're fairly assimilated into Roman Greek practices in terms of enslavement. And then, we also have this legacy of Jewish folks being enslaved from the Jewish wars in the mid-1st century. And so we also have this question of whether Jewish folk who were enslaved could remain faithful to their own laws while being enslaved. And that becomes a real live question, I think, for a lot of early Christ followers as well.
Thank you. Christy, anything?
Yeah, another piece of material culture, I think this is in her chapter, but it might be in Ross. But I'm thinking of the Arch of Titus that has basically it's in Rome and it has a depiction of Romans who are enslaving Jews after the destruction of the Second Temple. And so and women and children are there, they're chained, right? So everything that Catherine said, is, in many Jewish people were enslaving people and Jewish people were enslaved, right? And so that piece of material culture, good. Yes, this is good. That's the image right there. That's it right there. Yeah. So it just sort of shows the ways in which some Jewish people were enslaved through this, and then the Romans celebrated it and put this depiction on the Arch of Titus, which you can still see today. Right?
Wow. Powerful imagery for people to understand serious stuff. Dr. Cobb, your chapter highlights the sexual vulnerability of enslaved women in the Roman world. How does this inform the way we read passages about women in the New Testament, according to you?
Yes. Okay. So, I mean, gender and the ideas of sort of how an enslaved woman might have been treated in antiquity, that's, part of my specialization when it comes to slavery, gender and sexuality. And I mean, I think it really does impact the way we should be reading this. There are some enslaved women named in the New Testament. Rhoda is an example in Acts chapter 12, and she is enslaved by a woman named Mary, who lives in Jerusalem. And her depiction in that chapter in Acts is that she was doing the enslaved labor of what a doorkeeper, another sort of domestic worker in this time period. And this is a sort of, many people point to this as a description of what an early Christian house church might have looked like. And here we have an enslaved woman running to answer the door to let in the believers who are coming in to pray. Right. And so noticing these women, I think, who again have, are there, but have been sometimes hidden through scholarship or made invisible through scholarship is really important. The sexualization piece is also really important because we have a number of these passages that point to the way that free women in particular should remain pure and protect their bodies. But free women were able to protect their bodies because enslaved women were being sexualized and enslaved women were being used sexually. And this was again, a sort of daily life of an enslaved person, both male and female, but especially for women, were that they were able to be sexually violated pretty much at any time. That was like, it was just acceptable. It was acceptable behavior. And so in some ways, I think we should be thinking about this too, when we think about women in the New Testament and beyond in early Christianity, and the ways in which free women were able to protect their virginity, but enslaved women had no such ability to do that.
Any
additions, Katherine?
I mean, Christy is really the expert in this.
Yeah.
And
that's why I said, I was like, Dr. Cobb, you.
Yeah. And I'm going to just let it be, because I mean, it's a horrifying story, actually, to think about women who are enslaved. And the truth is that story repeats itself in our US history as well. And so I think that's the piece that Christy's scholarship really points to for me, is that this is not a new trope within slavery and what human beings do to each other.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Many Christians point to passages where Paul tells slaves to obey their masters. How should we read these texts in light of the brutal realities of slavery?
I mean, it depends on which of these texts we're looking at, right? There's sort of different approaches to different ones. If we're thinking about the undisputed Pauline letters, that is the 7 letters that we think Paul wrote, that we think Paul, the person, was involved in writing. The worst of it is in 1 Corinthians 7, where he says, look, if you were enslaved when you became a believer, don't try and change that. If you have the opportunity to be free, don't worry about it. And some of this gets passed off in Christian circles as Paul's apocalyptic agenda, right? Paul thinks that Jesus is coming back tomorrow, and so we don't need to make social changes in our world because Jesus is coming. The problem is that for 2,000 years, we've been saying, well, we don't need to make changes in our social world because Jesus is coming. We don't need to make changes in our social world because Jesus is coming. Well, the problem is, Jesus hasn't come in 2,000 years, first of all. And it's not that, we can still say Jesus is coming, but there is a way in which I think God wants us to live with each other right here and right now, that is in fact very different from the structures of power that our social and our governments set up for us oftentimes. Now, there's the other slaves obey your masters that come in Colossians, Ephesians, the pastoral epistles, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, actually 1 Timothy, Titus, let's just say. And there, I think we've got a community that is writing in Paul's name. I don't think Paul wrote any of those letters, although Colossians is more disputed than Ephesians. I'll give the scholarly world that. But nonetheless, this is a trope, right? Where you have a list. It's called a household code. And you have this list, right, of women obey men, children obey parents, slaves obey your masters, right? And so often we pull out that slaves obey your masters and go, yeah, we don't have slavery anymore, so we don't have to worry about that one. But women, you better obey your men. Like wives, you better be submissive to your husbands, right? Children, you better obey your parents. And that gets, I don't want to tell the kids not to obey their parents, but
of course, but there's I imagine it means something a little different than what we're saying. We're just saying, look, we want to keep you from losing an arm or whatever. I'm sure it's a different meaning.
Yeah, it absolutely is, because if you look at who is supposed to be obedient to whom, the only person who can actually fulfill all of those proclamations within these household codes is the male head of household. Because if you are married to that male head of household, who are you supposed to obey? Your father or your husband? If you're an enslaved person in that household and you have a partner, let's say you're an enslaved woman and you have a male partner, who are you supposed to obey? Your male partner, who's your husband, although he's not legally your husband because you can't legally get married as slaves. Are you supposed to obey your father, who might live in a different household and be enslaved to somebody else? Or are you supposed to obey your master, who has the power of life and death over you? All of a sudden, you start to see that these household codes, which are supposedly for good social organization, right, actually bring disorder when you start to think about who it is that cannot follow them. Now, it brings a lot of order for the head of household who can, right? And this comes all out of Aristotle's Politics. And Aristotle is actually not thinking about how does a family get structured. Aristotle's thinking about how does a city get structured? How does a democratic city get structured? Because you need people who are arguing about what they're going to agree to for common governance. Who has the time to go do that, especially when like the grapes are falling off the vines and you need to get them in right now for the harvest, and it's olive oil pressing season, and it's, this and that and the other thing. Well, Aristotle starts looking around and he's like, okay, wait a minute. I bet if we should have the male head of house, right? That is, we're going to talk about a household, which includes all of these people underneath the property owner. And the property owner is the one who's going to represent that whole basic unit to the governing structure, right? But that property owner, Aristotle has a problem there, because many people recognize that women, that enslaved people, they actually have better skills at governing than that property owner. And so he has to make this whole argument about how the property owner has the most virtue, reason, and rationality and is able to speak in these spaces. Women have some reason and rationality, but women, they're a little emotional, right? I mean, he like plays off the stereotypes.
Yeah,
the
that's
stereotypes.
Been since the beginning of time. I imagine we've been doing that.
Yeah, probably so. But then he gets into the problem of slaves. And Aristotle's got a real problem with slaves, because he says, look, I know they can talk to you, so it seems like they're more rational than like cows who make noises, but don't talk to you. But he's like, but really, they don't have any more reason, rationality, virtue than to be able to follow what their masters tell them to do. And then he says, but some of you don't think that, so I have to go a little bit further. And what's interesting is that when Aristotle says, I know that there's people who think slaves shouldn't exist, all of a sudden what we've got is ancient evidence for people who think slavery shouldn't exist. There were people in antiquity who thought slavery shouldn't exist. And one of the things that those opponents of Aristotle point out is you have war captives who were generals of their armies. those guys have some rationality, right? Those guys know what they're talking about. And Aristotle doesn't know how to answer that. And he just kind of goes, well, subjection does something to a person. So even Aristotle has to admit that this perfect, lovely order of obedience to masters can't quite work in the way that he wants it to.
Wow.
And we can see how this, like, this rationale for a kind of ordering of society moves through Aristotle to Augustus, who uses it to shape his Roman Empire. He says, hey, look, the Roman Empire is all one household and I'm the head of it. So, if we just follow Aristotle and I'm the head of the household, then we can all be a happy family, right?
Yeah, we saw how that turned out.
We saw how that turned out.
So the year of the 4 emperors, right? I mean,
right.
Just by the time that joke. Yeah, Christy, would you like to add anything there? And the one thing that came to my mind too along that was just thinking about, there are people right now, we're living in a crazy time. I'm not trying to get too political here, but there are people who are arguing we need to revoke women from voting, right? This goes back, I think, to the very thing Katherine was just saying about how, we need to give only the guys who are serving in the military the opportunity to vote, or like all of this structure goes way, way back. So anyway, I don't want to throw you off. Maybe you had something you'd rather address or something. But.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that Katherine did a really good job with all of that. But I mean, I think you're right that this kind of interpretation matters for today, politically, especially, and the reception of these verses has mattered. I mean, we know that in the history of America, these verses, slaves obey your masters, were read to in the enslaved persons on, say, a plantation, right? And so these were used to oppress. And I think some of these, as you're pointing out, Eric, like, are continuing to be used to oppress.
Right? Yeah, you can tell. I mean, I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I know that a lot of the philosophers were literally pontificating about this and like, who should? I mean, there is some, I listened to some of these things, like one reason that we should have people who are a little educated doing voting, because it's easy to manipulate an audience that isn't read or aware of what seems to be best for the society. So I can sympathize with that, but to pretend that like only men have that rationale, or to pretend that only men should have that opportunity, of course, we're way beyond that. And I don't know why, but people are trying to go back to that. You can hear people making arguments on very popular podcasts right now for that kind of reasoning, and I'm like, what in the hell is going on here? Excuse my friend. Okay.
No, it's so true, because we so often think that history is like, well, we know better than they did back then, but we don't have to fault them back then, because history has gone in this upward trajectory of more liberal or more progressive. It's not true, right? It goes high up into exploitation, and then like these justice movements will pop up, and then they'll have to go back underground again.
Right.
And I think part of my job as an ancient historian is also to find those movements as they pop up from our historical sources.
Well, actually, now that I have you on the screen, because my next question, as I had Dr. Cobb specialty focused, household codes, often taught as models of Christian family life, were written in a world where enslaved people were part of those households. Dr. Shaner, how does your chapter reframe those codes?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main way that it reframes them is to start to push back against them. To see them as a way of upholding singular male power, rather than a way of mutual governance, a way of mutual flourishing even. They really do reinscribe some of the very conservative male first, elite first kinds of structures within Christian communities. And I think what's really distressing to me about that is precisely the fact that just 10 or 20 years before these are inscribed in our scripture, you have women like Chloe, right, who are sending messages to Paul, albeit through her people who were probably her enslaved people. You have women like Phoebe, who's a deacon, who's carrying the letter to the Romans from Paul. She knows the Romans, Paul does not. You have women like Lydia, who has her own household. You have women like the Pythian slave woman in Acts, who Paul and Silas silence, right? Because they don't like what she says. But she, as Dr. Cobb has pointed out in a previous book, she is telling the truth that Paul and Silas are the servants of the Most High God, or in fact, the slaves of the Most High God, right? So, I think one of the things that I think we need to think about with the household codes is that there isn't one way of structuring a society, a city, or a family for all places and all time. And so, Aristotle's argument was useful for him. I probably would have hated it even then. But, the fact that Christians pick up on that argument because it's so useful for centralizing power and clarifying power is part of, for me, the critique of those texts in and of themselves. You've got to look at the power dynamics that these texts create. You've got to look at the way that the interpretations of these texts create particular power structures in our world, and ask some questions about whether those are ethical power structures.
Thank you so much. Christy, did you want to add to that, or would you?
I'll just say, I think Katherine's chapter also sort of shows us that importance of centering enslaved experience when reading the New Testament. So when we're looking at the household codes, we imagining how an enslaved person would have heard these and navigated those and all the complexities of their experience in that, if they were to hear or read that part of the letter. I think that gives us a different perspective on that text, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. I've got another question, but real quick, shameless plug. Again, if you haven't taken the time to get the book, it's only $8.85 right now, hardcover. Get the book. It's a great reference tool. I highly recommend if you're trying to get your head wrapped around ancient slavery. So a few more for me, and then if you're okay with doing Q&A, I'd love to do that. So The book doesn't stop in antiquity. This is something that I think is important. It also draws connections to modern slavery and human trafficking. What continuities do you see between ancient systems and today? And we'll start with you, if that's okay with you, Christy, and then go to Katherine.
Yeah. So this is Zimmerman's chapter at the sort of end of the book. And she advocates for sort of slow down ethics in thinking about these connections. And so is there a one-to-one, connection in modern contemporary slavery and ancient? No. But are there a number of ways that we can compare the two? Yes. Right. Which also, I think, works for transatlantic slavery, slavery in the American South, right? Thinking through all those things. So there is much that we can learn from considering the ways that slavery is presented in the New Testament and today. And then also, I think she sort of challenges this idea that of sort of all, well, not all, but many evangelical Christians really care about this idea of sex trafficking, right? It's an important thing to care about, but she wants to sort of put it into perspective. If we're going to really care about that, should we also care about, global slavery in countries where people are forced to create many of the items we buy at our stores today, right? Should we be concerned about that? Should we be concerned about systemic racism and incarceration in the United States, which is another aspect of the ways that slavery is happening right here in the United States, right? And so putting that sort of the idea of how slavery is wrestled with by Christians today into sort of context, I think that chapter does a really good job of.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually mind-boggling when we start to think about it, because for many of us, slavery is so deeply hidden in our everyday lives here in the U.S. There's a website called slaveryfootprint.org. That it's a little bit outdated because there's still like cassette tapes on the instead of CDs or something. The electronics haven't been updated, but basically it is designed to create awareness of the fact that all of us who live in the US have some kind of connection to slavery if we're simply living our lives, even if we've never met an enslaved person. So, and Christy hit on that, like the clothing that we wear, the electronics that we use. I have never done their survey and had less than 30 slaves working for me in a given year. And that's, and I'm not claiming to be super ethical. I'm not claiming to actually think about it a whole lot during the regular day, but that is to say that we don't even think about it, right? And there are ways in which some of the contemporary politics around immigration are also playing into slave trade and slave labor. Because when one is undocumented, one needs protection. Where does one find protection from an enslaver? That these are things that are happening in our own world whenever folks have to go underground to protect their lives, but they still need money. That's when you create a situation where slavery can start to rise fairly quickly.
Wow. Oh, modern implications. There's so much here. I've got several super chats. I had a couple more questions, but they kind of touch the same stuff that you actually already touched on. And so I don't want to give them everything. They have to get the book. Okay. So if we keep going, you literally are just going to give everything away. Now, clearly there's much more detail and it's far more in depth than what we could even barely touch here. But I think we gave quite a bit of an outline on understanding and wanting people to get this book and get a copy so they can read it for themselves. It's not a huge book too. That's the interesting part. It's not. Yeah. Let me put you full screen here so people can see.
them volume.
Yeah. Not
and it's
too
beautiful.
much.
There's beautiful pictures.
Yes. Get the book, ladies and gentlemen. Go support good scholarship. We all want to learn more about this. And I will turn to Q&A now, if that's okay with both of you.
That's great.
Awesome. Okay. S. Mill in the house. Thank you for the super chat. How do you encompass dichotomy of early Christianity being sect that attracted slaves, poor and marginalized, but spread by educated elite that used slaves to spread it? Is one myth or can be combined? I'm not sure exactly what that last part means, but I'm sure you get the general question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's two myths, actually. The first is that early Christianity attracted slaves, the poor and the marginalized. I think it did to some extent, insofar as we have examples from, let's say, Ignatius of Antioch, who's a bishop, who writes to the church in Ephesus and says, hey, look, I hear you're freeing slaves through your common treasury, through the money that you collect together as a community. And he's like, stop doing that. You're going to go bankrupt if you do that. Now, who knows whether Ignatius was against letting slaves go free or what? He was giving economic advice in this particular letter. But what it also shows us is that there was a community in Ephesus who thought that their job was to free the slaves with the money that they had, to use their own wealth to free enslaved people. So, I think we can't look at early Christians. We can't look at the earliest Christ followers as singular. They don't have a singular sensibility. Many times in early Christian history, there's this myth of like, there's the tiny little group in Jerusalem, and then they all kind of like gradually just sort of ripple out like ripples in a pond, and they all look alike until there's some schism that makes them all not look alike. Well, it really was much more chaotic than that. Think about a rainstorm on a lake, right? All the ripples are going all the other places, and we see places where the ripples cross each other. Just think Peter and Paul in Acts, or Galatians, right? The whole text, the whole thing. So we do have groups that are accepting of those who are impoverished, those who are enslaved, those who are marginalized, who have women who are leaders, women who are prophets, women who are bankrolling the whole thing, right? But then we also have these groups that we hear more about, which are the ones that are headed by men, where slaves are used as part of the way the community runs, where impoverished people are just charity cases. So now the second myth that I wanted to just address really quickly in this question was that it was spread by educated elite that used slaves to spread it. That's not actually a myth. That's exactly what happened. Because someone like Candida Moss has pointed out, right, that the texts were all probably physically written by enslaved people. And we see that in Romans. We see Tertius in chapter 16 of Romans. And so I think we have to start thinking about what are the implications of the fact that our texts are physically written by enslaved people and not necessarily by the people whose names the texts bear.
Would you like to tackle this, Christy?
I think she did a great job, so I'll let you get to another one.
Okay, Daniel Kyle, thanks for the super chat. I will do my best to post when I'm going to do live streams more often and videos. Apologies if I didn't give advance notice. Usually, if you just go to my face channel, you'll see like upcoming live streams and stuff. And I didn't really think to like make it more public of like all of this in advance. I should do better though in the future. Solera Knight, thank you for the super chat. Words like hymen, menstrual, and menopause all have men in them, yet are related to females. Why? I don't know if that's even related to anything here. But I don't know. Do you know?
I'm right now going like trying to track all these in the Greek. I'm like, Do you know, Catherine?
Okay, I was actually just going to say in the Greek, men isn't male. Andros is, right? So, and these are all words that come from Greek roots. And meno, I'm trying to remember what meno means. Or men, but I could probably, I mean, we're online. I could probably look it up.
Yeah, if you feel like looking it up, sure.
I don't really know. I'd have to do a lot more research to kind of figure out exactly where it comes from, but they are all Greek roots.
Gotcha. It's just maybe coincidental that it has in English hymen, menstrual, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Thank you for the super chat. Daniel Kyle with the super chat. Property rights seem to inherently be tied to slavery. Money was tied to resources and debt. To have to owe someone means you're subjugated to them.
So people often point out a category in the Roman world called debt slavery, where you essentially, sell yourself to somebody in order to pay off your debts for a certain amount of time or, a certain amount of labor, whatever that is. It's not the same thing as chattel slavery. And it's not as prevalent in the ancient world as we would like to say it is. Because somehow being a slave because of debts feels a little less cruel, right? I mean, but I think that has to do with our own pathology around debt as well. And sort of the structures that debt creates within our social world that do create, I mean, you're exactly right, Daniel, they do create subjugation.
You could see a progressed less form even in our modern society. Like I bought a house. If I stop paying the bills, if I don't go to work, if I don't, my family is going to suffer and I could go to jail. I mean, I could, there's ways in which we're trapped in the system, but it's not obviously anything like the slavery in that sense. But there's like, you can see like elements of it where I can't just not do something. Like I have to do something and contribute to make enough income to cover and provide and, you know, all of that. I don't know if that makes any sense what I'm saying here, but
I mean, I think what you're noting is that part of the way we understand slavery is through our own understandings of the things we have to do that we don't choose to do.
right. Like all three of us, maybe we like doing what we do. We're lucky for that. But like, you know, all three of us, we're living somewhere. We have to eat. We have to, and maybe one day we get to a place where things get so good where we don't have to deal with all this. I don't know. I think it's probably never going to happen, but
we could do some capitalist critiques, but then we're getting, I think, a ways away from slavery.
Yeah. Right. I'm just thinking out loud. Daniel Kyle, thanks again for the super chat. Rise of kings came with demand of rent to subjugate and create servants. The first tithe was a tax. With kings comes the patriarchal order. Do you think during the matriarchal period there was slavery?
Catherine, do you have some thoughts? Or
I want to know when the matriarchal period was.
Yeah. I've heard some people try, and I don't know, maybe I'm guessing here for Daniel. I've heard people say like way back in the day before kings and civilizations and men ran the whole show, there were tribes where women, you know, running the show, things like that. I don't know what the
Deborah comes to mind.
Okay.
From the Old Testament, right?
Yeah, but that's like one little window of like a moment, right? Where she. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, Daniel. This is you're stumping us. We'll have to go and get to think and read a bit more. But one thing I'll just say that's sort of connected, which is related to my work, is that women were just as cruel of enslavers as men. And I mean, wow. I'm sorry to like feels like something people say, oh, women, oh, they must have been nicer. No, that's not the evidence that we have, right? And so there were many women, both in antiquity and in, you know, transatlantic slavery period, right, where women were very cruel, right? And even when they had the opportunity to free enslaved persons, they didn't, right? Using enslaved women in their household were, you know, so I don't know if that's part of the question that Daniel's getting to. Is this like in a time period if women were ruling, would there not be slavery, right? And that's a sort of open question I think we're thinking about. But I guess I just want to say that in the period of early Christianity, we do have Christian women who enslaved persons and who were, you know, just as similarly cruel as the men.
Thank you. That's important to note. Yeah. Solera Knight, thank you for the super chat. Modern tax slaves.
Mm-hmm. What I don't know what yeah, I will say that I looked up minos in Greek. This is Solera, the same person who asked about menopause, right?
Yes.
And it's month. And so it isn't, yeah. So menstrual and menopause is the sort of related to, I think, in my quick looking, the Greek term for monthly that then comes in. So not related to men, but I don't know about the modern tax slaves. So what do you think, Catherine? Yeah.
I mean, I think there is kind of an argument that we are enslaved to taxes, right? Because the government will come after us if we don't pay them, etc. But there's a difference, I think, between the ability to willfully resist, which we can do with our taxes, and the terror of punishment by death that was part of enslavement. You know, crucifixion was a death that was reserved for enslaved people. And part of the reason it was effective was that it was so horrible to witness. And we have the same history in the US with lynchings. Part of the reason that it was such an effective tool for keeping Jim Crow in place was because it was so terrifying and so random. And I would say that taxes, while I do not like paying them, and I am horrified at the bill that I get every year. In fact, our property taxes just went up a whole lot here in Winston-Salem. Talk about modern privilege. But I'm not sure that it's slavery in that sense. I think there's a lot that actually our taxes do for us that we don't see as well.
Right. You're not
but
like
then
a
I'm
modern...
starting to get into politics.
Yeah, and I'm not educated enough to know all the ins and outs of all of this, but I could see you're going to get overlap. In some respect, there's going to be overlap to certain models, but that doesn't mean we should necessarily make them the same. Let's not have like what is it, an association fallacy to suggest one must mean the other. But maybe the context of taxes also matters. I mean, we had the Boston Tea, situation, but then you have certain situations where not every situation about taxing needs to be, but I imagine there's something's related there. I'm sure. I'm just not educated on it either. By the way, we had someone in the chat who said that I'm a professor. Menstruation comes from Latin, which means month.
There we go.
So,
good.
There you go. You were right.
Great.
Yay. Okay. Esmil says, frightening to think we have capability to rationalize many humans are fated to be lesser beings than others and carried over to church. Free men, women, slaves.
Absolutely. It is. It's frightening. And not only rationalized, but justified, right? So over and over again, this sort of justification of slavery. That's another chapter we didn't talk about, but the early Christian slavery and early Christianity that's in the volume talks about this and the way that church fathers continually sort of rationalize and justify it and in some ways try to say, okay, we could be kinder to our enslaved persons, but it's still there, right? In early Christianity.
Thank you so much. Solara Knight again says, that is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Genesis 2:24. A single entity, a unit, not a hierarchy.
This is great. A good question. You probably already know this, Solara, but there's the 2 creation stories, right, in Genesis. And so chapter 1 gives us the hierarchy that, and sort of, chapter 2, but chapter 1 gives us a sort of slightly different story of creation than chapter 2, starting 2 verses 4, right? And so if we sort of separate the creations, we might have there might be some room for a unity, maybe, right? At least in some readings. And then if we sort of look at chapter 2, which leans into the punishments, and you can chime in if you want, Katherine, here, but that's sort of like punishments for the disobedience that happened in the garden, then that's where we get the man over women, right? Which I do read as hierarchy, right?
Yeah. I think there's something to that.
I think there are lots of egalitarian images in the Bible. We just don't often use them.
Interesting.
Right. I mean, think about woman wisdom as co-creator in Proverbs 8. We look at the Proverbs woman instead of woman wisdom, right? When we look at Proverbs, but woman wisdom she's the wise one who creates with God, right? So we've got lots of gender parity that we just don't highlight.
And if you follow that back, I've done a few documentaries going deep diving into this, but Asherah, okay? So I know at some point they fill in the gap of the feminine divine with woman wisdom. And at one point, there's good reason to suggest there was a family hierarchy there, and that eventually there was only Father God and his Ruach and woman wisdom. But notice how Asherah has moved aside. And so I like that older model personally, as I'm looking at this, like, doing my own little research. I like the idea of a wife of God and things like that, personally. But yeah, what do I know? What do I know? I love everybody. Thank you so much for the super chats. We got a couple more here. And then I had one question I saw brought up in the chat. It's about Philemon and how to understand Paul there. So Daniel Kyle says, is orthodoxy is a continuation of Aristotle philosophy? Could the varieties of Christianities be the continuation of different philosophical schools?
I mean, I certainly think that the different philosophical schools show up in different places in the Christian tradition. You know, Paul seems to know some Stoicism. We've got, of course, in the 2nd century, Neoplatonism and Plato's Timaeus become like almost a second scriptural canon, right? Some of Plato's writings are, and then of course Aristotle shows up then again in Aquinas in the Middle Ages, and Augustine, and therefore Aristotle shows up in Luther, right? So we've got lots of these ancient philosophical traditions that are sort of infused throughout lots of different Christian groups, and I'm not sure that you can parse it out to say this is the philosophical school the Orthodox are following, this is the philosophical school the Lutherans are following, this is the one that, you know, Russian Orthodox are going to go with. We actually can see all of it kind of infused throughout.
Thank you so much. My next one is Adonijah Corey. Please speak on the Synagogue of Freedmen.
I can take this. Yeah, this is in the book of Acts, right? So good job even noticing this, because it's a very passing reference that is mentioned by the author of Acts, that there is this, right, Synagogue of Freedmen. And so, I mean, a number of scholars have even sort of like thought about this and tried to see if historically we know of any place. And I mean, so far we haven't seen evidence of it historically, right? That there was a synagogue just for freed persons. But I think the idea behind it is that freed persons did, identify collectively a number of times and join together in some sort of maybe a voluntary association kind of thing could have been happening here, right? And they did often work together, and that could be what the author of Acts is noting here. What I think is really interesting too is this idea that when they're sort of present in Acts, they're there in order to influence the apostles, right? So they're sort of mentioned in this moment in Acts, and they seem to have a bit of, I don't know, pull, right? In within the narrative of Acts. And so it's interesting to think about. We don't know what that might be referencing historically.
Thank you so much. And then last one, thank you, Ida, for being a member for 2 months. By the way, if you join the membership program, I've got like a bunch of videos that I worked really hard on. Early access you can watch, and it keeps our lights on here at MythVision. So thank you. Many were probably prisoners of war, slaves during the Roman Empire. Perhaps these were more slaves than natives. So, I think they mean like non-natives as slaves, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, so Ulrika Roth in her chapter really talks about sources of slaves in the ancient world, but one of the main sources was, in fact, war captives. So, the Roman Empire, they had this idea of the Pax Romana, which was within its borders, all was well and peaceful. But like you get closer to those borders and the wars are raging. And each time the Romans have a victory, there's a new influx of enslaved people who come on the market. And Josephus tells us this about the Jewish wars. One of the things the Romans did was they would line up their war captives and they'd look for the most burly, like beautiful, perfect specimens, and they'd keep those for themselves. And the rest they would send off to the slave markets to filter in through other parts of the empire. And then they would take these beautiful slaves back to Rome and parade them through the city streets to impress all of the Romans at how great they are at capturing people. So war captives absolutely were one piece of the enslaved trade, but there were ways in which, I mean, but there was also a home breeding program of sorts. It may not have been as systematic as that term would show, but there are slaves who are called homeborn slaves, which means if you're born to an enslaved mother, you are the enslaved property of her enslaver, even if her enslaver is your father. Right. So, and we have evidence that actually the increase in enslaved population has more to do with home births than it necessarily does with war captives.
Wow. She said treated worse than natives, I meant.
Yeah. I mean, you know, a lot of times war captives were sent to the mines. I mean, so like there were hierarchies within enslaved imagination about where you wanted to end up. And you did not want to end up in the salt mines or the silver mines or the iron mines for maybe obvious reasons. You did want to end up in the house of the emperor, maybe, because you'd have access to wealth, you'd have access to power, you might have access to education. That doesn't mean life is better because you're still enslaved and the emperor still has you're still sexually available, you still have your owner still has the power of life and death over you. But there were ways that some enslaved people had better lives than others, but it feels very random instead of instead of working by ethnicity or race or where you came from.
I've heard that, by the way. We live in a different world on YouTube and on the internet, I think, than a lot of academics who are doing their work. We live in a world where there are apologists that see the problem, and so then they go, you know, if it weren't for slavery, they'd die. They'd have no food. So thankfully for being the slave system actually was better for people than non-slaves. I mean, like they literally made it seem like free men had it worse than slaves often. And I remember watching an interesting debate. Kip Davis and Joshua Bowen, I believe it was, they debated two Christians, well-articulate Christians, but they brought up the Hammurabi's Code. And in Hammurabi's Code, there's this example where after 3 years, you set your slave free. The Bible says 6. Mm-hmm. Okay. So they pitched this to the Christians, right? And in the debate, and the Christians said to them, well, you know, it's actually better. It's double the food that they get to live for 3 more years being taken care of. You know how bad it was in the ancient world, and slavery was there, and it was a good system for them at that time. You know, all this. And we had private conversations afterwards, and we asked the question, and we said, now, what if it was the other way around? Honestly, if the Bible said 3 years and Hammurabi said 6, you know damn well they would have said, the Bible gives us 3 less. I mean, it's half of the amount of time. And like, it's just anything they can.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, one of the myths to destroy is that when you're talking about legal texts, about laws, just because there are laws does not mean they were actually followed. They are an ideal.
True.
Right. So, yeah. But to tell you the truth, that debate happens in scholarly circles too, and I'm a little baffled by it.
That's probably, we're in an unfortunate situation. I think just more education. My last question was about the Philemon thing, and it was just related to people who were chatting, and I thought they had a really interesting point. Was that they say, well, Paul's whole point was to free the slave. In Philemon, it was like, free the slave. So they're using that, or their point was they thought maybe Paul is indicating like he's not for this. He's kind of against this whole thing. Do you have a comment? I can see Christy's face like, I got something to say.
Well, we both got something to say.
Yeah. I mean, Philemon is the place to go about, you know, slavery in the New Testament, because it's like, that's the whole book. And so it is, I mean, so first of all, that is an interpretation of Philemon, right? One interpretation is that Paul was intending to send Onesimus back to his enslaver Philemon in the hope that he will free him. So that is one interpretation, and that has gotten some traction in some circles, right? And then another interpretation of Philemon is that Paul was sending Onesimus back to be to continue to be enslaved, right? But as perhaps a believer, right? He says more than a slave, as a brother, right? So perhaps, that. There's another even interpretation that Paul was a co-enslaver of Onesimus. And so, because this happened in the ancient world where two people might enslave one person, perhaps for finances, or maybe because they needed a specialized enslaved person to do particular labor, and they didn't need them for full time, so they might share the labor back and forth. So one scholar has suggested that Paul was a co-enslaver and sending Onesimus back. Okay, it's your turn with Onesimus's labor. I'm in prison, right? Or whatever. So do you want to add more to this, Katherine? Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, if Paul really meant to free Onesimus, there are many other very clear ways to do that. And he did not do that. I mean, he didn't say it in the letter. Like, he didn't say, Onesimus is now your eleftheros, your freed person, right? He didn't say, eleftheros doesn't show up in that letter. So the word freedom isn't there. But I also think, we have to look at the use of the text. So we look at the Dred Scott laws in the 1850s, and the Supreme Court cited Philemon as the reason for Dred Scott to be returned to his master. You look at the runaway slave laws in the U.S. The U.S. Congress cites Philemon and Paul's authority as the grounds upon which runaway slaves can be forcibly taken back to their masters, even if they've made it to free states. So I like that we're trying really hard to find ways to see see freedom in our texts. I want to say yes to that impulse every single time. But I think sometimes we try too hard to make Paul the hero of that impulse toward freedom, when what we need to make the hero of it is the system that creates justice. That needs to be the hero, I think, of our tale.
I can totally relate to that. I think we all want to see more people look for the good, or try to see good in it, instead of trying to just, because there's some people who are defending it as is, and they accept the ugly nature of it, and they go, that's just, that's godly. And it's like, ooh. So anyway, we've gone all over the place. Is there any final words? I'm going to shamelessly plug your book again for viewers. Get a copy, Ancient Slavery and its New Testament Context. Wonderful academics, Christy Cobb, Katherine Shaner, I sincerely appreciate your time. Final words from both of you before we wrap things up.
Oh, this was just a really fascinating conversation, and I appreciate your questions from the viewers too.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us on, and I'm just going to say, go read the book. I think it's fascinating.
We did get a final little question, super chat, if that's okay. Luke 4:18, proclaim liberty to the captives, set at liberty those who are oppressed, end of slavery.
So that's a quotation from Isaiah during Jesus's initial sermon in Nazareth. So Jesus is standing up in his home synagogue reading this out of Isaiah, which I think is, so what that says is this idea of setting the captives free goes all the way back to the beginnings. It's not a uniquely Christian or a uniquely Jesus idea. And you notice that the people in the synagogue are actually really proud of Jesus for proclaiming this. And I think that's amazing. He ultimately gets in trouble because he says, yeah, but I didn't come for any of you all. I came for all those other people. He gets in trouble because of his mission to the Gentiles, but not because of this liberty piece. I think this is a beautiful piece, but it's set in a story that, of course, highlights some of the tensions.
But what does it mean? Does he intend to actually free, he's saying end of slavery here? Or is there a sense in which he's saying something theological, like is Luke's theology coming through that's kind of saying, look, it's not this world, it's this, it's some spiritual thing, kind of like John. You know how Luke and John are kind of close, even though John's its own thing, where it's like you must be born from above. That's in this theology, maybe it means to set the captives free is to literally be born from above, or to somehow go to heaven. I don't know what, because I know in the Old Testament, they probably do think literal captives of actual people need to be freed. You've got the Jubilee, you know, there's like real world stuff going on. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I mean, my first thought is that Luke tends to choose the material over the spiritual anyway. You think about the Beatitudes in Luke. Blessed are the poor, end of story, right? For theirs is the kingdom of God. Not blessed are the poor in spirit, like Matthew says. So, you know, for me, Luke goes to the material before the spiritual, or as the spiritual. Christy's the expert on Luke, however.
I mean, my hunch is it doesn't mean the end of slavery, right? Right. I mean, it's ideal. It would be ideal, right? But it obviously, I mean, we pointed to later sections in Luke where, you know, Luke's Jesus uses this language of slavery, right? A similar thing happens in the opening of Acts where, you know, Peter quotes Joel to say, you know, enslaved people will speak prophecy, right? And so then the whole of Acts, we have enslaved persons just, I mean, throughout are still being used to support, you know, to support the labor of the free people in Acts. So there isn't, I don't know that there is liberty for enslaved persons. That's like ending on a bad note, but you know what I mean? But
gotcha.
Yeah.
But the ideal is there. I mean, this is the thing.
The
like,
ideal
you have
is
to
there.
you have to push through sometimes all of the hard stuff to see these little glimmers.
Yeah.
The glimmers are there.
Yeah.
And the fact that someone could see that is a good sign. To try and interpret it that way is a good sign. I really, really loved this episode. I learned a lot from both of you, and I hope that people get the book. Please update me. Let me know. Look, MythVision we're very proud of supporting the academics who come on. The way that you can do that, if you're watching now, is get their books. They work very hard to publish and write and edit. And I know from talking to many close friends who are academics, nothing feels better than when an interviewer, when I come on, can go on page 243 of your book, or like when they're like, oh, they've really absorbed my material. That's the best thing I can do for you. And I'm hoping the viewers do as well. So
thank you.
Thank you. By the way, I lived in North Carolina most of my life, Vietnam.
Hey.
Oh, wow.
Wow. I don't think I've ever heard it called that, but I can see why it would be.
I decided to go right with Nam and just not call it Fayetteville.
I actually, Derek, lived in Fayetteville for a few years too.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to now think of the years. It might have been like 2003 to 2007 or something like that. Yeah. Okay. So
I was graduating around that time.
Were you? Okay.
Yeah, I was we were kind of near Ramsey Street. I don't know if you know these names.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay. I do.
So we're like down the street from Ramsey Street. I lived right around the corner there for like 25 years of my life. So
oh, wow, 25 years. Yeah.
Military brat though, been all over. So anyway.
Yeah. Oh, nice. I taught for a little while at Fayetteville Tech Community College. You know that.
Yeah, I know exactly where it is. Yeah.
Randomly. Yeah.
Absolutely. Get the book, ladies and gentlemen. Their book is amazing. They are excellent speakers. They have lots of insight. I hope to have them come back, and maybe they have future or previous publications we can cover, show them some love so that they can go, you know what? I want to go back on that channel. I thought that was a great, channel. Please do that for me. Do that for yourself. Do that for them. And thank you so much. Make sure you never forget, we are MythVision.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland. and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.